Well, hey everyone, I'm going to be doing a reaction video about a conversation that went absolutely viral a little bit of time ago, primarily between Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson, and it has to do with subjects related to lust and pornography. So let's take a look.
Obviously, Christianity and Judaism are not identical religions. We have no equivalent that if you look upon another woman with lust, it's as if you have committed adultery with your heart. There's only one way to commit adultery in Judaism, and it's with a different organ.
All right, so interesting point just right at the start where he is emphasizing, and he's right, what Jesus was doing on the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about the whole idea of adultery of the heart. It was new. It is in some ways a revolutionary idea. And so even Dennis Prager, as a Jewish man, is talking about the idea of like, yeah, what Jesus said, that's not what we say. Now, he gets a little bit more controversial with what he says afterwards.
And I'm not being cute. I'm being very realistic. Looking with lust is not a sin in Judaism.
What's the stance on pornography? Just to put you on the spot.
You did indeed. Okay, so my answer, when it's raised on my radio show, I have a male-female hour, and I'm very open about sexual subjects. I always ask if a wife calls me and says, my husband looks at pornography, I found on his computer, I have one question. How is your life of intimacy with your husband? Is it good? In other words, is the pornography in lieu of you or in addition to you? Mm-hmm. And I know this is not a religious answer, and mm-hmm. I'm not even giving a religious answer. I'm giving mm-hmm. what I think is a moral and realistic answer. Men want variety. And if adultery is a substitute for, if pornography is a substitute for one's wife, it's awful. If it's a substitute for adultery, it's not awful.
Now, he's already once again gone into, he's not a Christian, he's Jewish, and he's talking to some degree. It's interesting when he talks about the whole idea of men like variety, which I think has widely been shown to be a true stereotype of men. The question is not whether or not that's true. The question is what we do with that. If we as men do find that there's a part of ourselves that either sexually gets bored, which I definitely, my observation is that's much stronger in some men than it is in others. But if that's true, the question is, what do you do about that? And I don't think that should ever be a covering for something that's wrong. But I think the other thing that Dennis Prager is doing, which you can understand it, is that he's sort of doing problem triage here. That he's looking at the situation and he's saying that, maybe he's looking at a culture where there's tons and tons of divorce and there's all kinds of problems, and he's looking at it and saying, okay, if a guy is occasionally or maybe even regularly looking at pornography, but he's not having an affair, he's not neglecting his wife, he just has a much stronger sex drive than her, or maybe he just feels like this gives him a little bit of something extra that he doesn't get from his sex life with his wife, but he's not having an affair and he's not neglecting her sexually. I'm just going to live with that. He's not promoting it as a good, but he's promoting it as sort of a not bad. And I think that on the one hand, I would say, well, yeah, there are things that are worse, and then there are things that are not as bad. We can recognize that, and we can say, all right, pornography use in marriage certainly is, as Christians we'd say, certainly is a big problem, and is a problem that is heartbreaking to most wives in this situation. So we could say, all right, is that as bad as adultery? I would say, well, no, it's not as bad as adultery. I don't think that the point that Jesus is making is that they are precisely the same. But that doesn't mean that it's a problem that we should shrug off. And I think in my opinion, it's naive to treat it as a problem that can sort of be isolated to one area. I think that it does have to do, I think that it's a source of infidelity of sorts. Jesus certainly talks about that. And also I think that pornography tends to run rampant in our lives much more than just being an occasional thing. There might be situations where it's more occasional or less occasional, but for many men in our culture, especially with the internet, is widely used and ends up having major impacts on lives.
That is my unpredictable
Well,
answer.
there is a clinical rule of thumb.
By the way, I'm not sure what the yin and yang. I want to know. I hope they spent the first half hour of this episode of Jordan Peterson's show of just explaining why he's wearing what he's wearing, because there's got to be a reason behind it.
Rule of thumb that's akin to that, I would say, if you're trying to decide clinically whether someone's partaking in a habit, say use of alcohol, has reached the threshold of clinical significance, one of the things you do is ask the person you're assessing, is it interfering with your employment? Has it got you in trouble with the law? Is your family complaining? Does it stop you from doing other things that you should be doing? And so the judgment isn't the use of the forbidden substance itself. It is in some sense consequentialist. And I'm not saying that that's an absolute, but it is a hallmark of clinical judgment.
Yeah, and it was interesting that Peterson went there because he's almost addressing a different question. He's not addressing the moral question. He's addressing more of the clinical question, which is legitimate to look at a problem. If you're talking to somebody or if you're even looking at yourself to say, all right, how much has this issue, whether it is alcohol, whether it's pornography, whether it's, even in some cases like shopping or eating, that there can be a variety of different things that we could say, this is a problem, but let me try to assess how much has taken over my life, not for the sake of excusing it, but for the sake of just kind of figuring out what is going on here. Because if it's taken over your life, if you're missing time at work, and I've heard the same thing from other counselors that they'll say, if men are missing work to go to strip clubs and things like that, you treat that differently than somebody who otherwise is fairly functional in life. But for us as believers, we would say, well, there clearly there's a problem. And I think for pornography, it often is something where there almost is a little bit of a numbing of something inside of us, maybe as men sort of like calming us down or easing us into something that ends up missing. It not only is something that's sinful and wrong and harmful to our view of women, but it also is something that ends up short-circuiting us actually dealing with some stuff before God, because there's something that drives us to it. It might be that we kind of feel like a sense of inadequacy, like I'm not an adequate, strong man, but this somehow brings that out in me. That's something to deal with before the Lord, because it's going to have implications in other areas of life. So I think Peterson's right to make the distinction within that, but it doesn't address the moral problem. And also, it doesn't put it in a category where, at least in my opinion, where it doesn't need to be dealt with. It still needs to be dealt with. And once again, Jesus is very clear on this. We could have discussions about when does lust become lust. In pornography, there's no question. It definitely has crossed over into lust and voyeurism and watching something that clearly is engaging in sinful behavior. So it's interesting to watch the discussion on it, but in some ways, Prager bringing up the idea that he has a difference of opinion is highlighting just how new and revolutionary and inside out Jesus' teaching is, and just how revolutionary the Sermon on the Mount as a whole is. Now, later on, because of how viral this conversation went, Prager had several follow-ups to this, and so we're going to watch one of his follow-ups where he gives some points of clarification.
When I answered the question that Jordan Peterson asked, which came out of nowhere, I'm not blaming him in the least.
Didn't come out of nowhere. We were talking about lust, and he brought up pornography. I don't think he's trying to throw Peterson under the bus, but that did not come out of nowhere.
It was a perfectly legit question, but it came out of nowhere. I was thinking still in the way I have always defined it as Playboy magazine. That, to me, that was porn. The stuff that is out there now is not what I think of when I'm asked the question. So my dad was an Orthodox Jew, modern Orthodox, admittedly, but Orthodox, never drove on the Sabbath, never ate a non-kosher food, wore a yarmulke in the house, sent the kids to yeshiva. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was the real deal. And he subscribed to Playboy, which shocks Jews as well as non-Jews, to be honest.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Glad that it does.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't think that there's anything wrong with noticing that there's been a progression with pornography in sort of the Playboy magazine versus some of the more hardcore stuff that's out there. I think it's all right to notice that. I still think nobody could make the argument that Playboy is not promoting lust and the objectification of women, which I don't think that he's necessarily even arguing that. So it's a matter of degree. And I'm not saying that the matter of degree doesn't matter at all. Sure, it does matter, but it's not a difference in kind. It's a difference in degree.
Okay. However, so I was raised in a very sexually open home that was also deeply religious, and I never found them conflicting. I want people to understand my parents were together 72 years, and they loved each other crazy. And she knew he got Playboy. This did not trouble my mother. Oh, that's Mac. Okay, I'm married to a live wire who was faithful and who loved me, and she was crazy about him, and that was it.
What would be better? For your father to love your mother and get Playboy, or for your father to say, even though I'm tempted to look at pornography, my wife's body is enough for me, and I'm not going to look at that even though I'm tempted to?
That's a very
Which
fair
is better?
question.
I think it's a pornified culture that's given us this idea.
The ideal life would involve none of this. I am not preoccupied with the ideal life. I am preoccupied with a good life. As I often say, I am not interested in making saints. I am interested in making good people. And it is so hard to make good people in a post-communist, post-Nazi world, post-Islamic, it's not post yet, Islamic terrorist world. I admit I am preoccupied with real evil rather than non-idyllic behavior.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the only real point of clarification that he brought, or even a little bit of backtracking, was saying the kind of porn that I'm thinking of is tamer than some of the pornography out there today. The rest of it seems to be absolutely the same in all of this. Maybe the other point, I don't know that he overtly said this, but maybe the other point of clarification is that in the case of his parents, that he was saying, my dad did this and my mom didn't care. Maybe if his mom did care, he would have thought something different. I'll actually get back to that in a second. But really, he's still dealing with the triage area where he's saying, because this isn't as evil or as big of a problem as these other things, I'm not going to get caught up in it. I'm going to be sort of expedient and say, if this is going to keep people married and, sort of functional in society, I'm all right with it. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. I get where he's coming from when he talks about the comparison. It still is something that as Christians, we have to absolutely disagree with him on and hold a different line on this and say, and part of it is when he talks about his mother didn't care, I don't think he's lying. I think she did. I find little to no evidence of the likelihood of the idea that his mother was not bothered by this. She may have sort of made some peace about it and come to accept it in a way that allowed them still to function. I don't buy the idea that it didn't bother her or make her feel insecure or make her feel devalued. I think that that's highly unlikely. So it's an interesting clarification. Not the points of clarification that I think are deeply meaningful to us as Christians. We would still say, nope, this is wrong. We have to fight against it. We understand what the battle is, but it's not with alcohol, where with alcohol you can say, hey, there's a moderate amount that you can take and still be celebrating a good gift from God. That's not the same with pornography. There's not a moderate amount of pornography to say, that's perfectly fine, go ahead and do it. We'd say, nope, we want to absolutely eradicate this from our lives, from our culture, from our homes. We want to fight against this as much as we can because it is bringing down a generation of men. And no man who's looking at pornography feels good about himself. It feels like, yeah, I'm doing meaningful things by doing this. It's something that deadens us much more than building us up. And I think that that's one of the ways that we see the corrosive impact of this on both men and women.